all right. Welcome to the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast. This is episode number 19, and it's the second installment of our Social Work Outside the Status Quo series. And we recorded this one live from the NASW National Conference in Chicago.
Our guest in this episode is Dr. Paul Michael Garrett, and he is a social work educator and writer based in Ireland. He's actually been described by the International Journal of Social Welfare as, and I quote, probably the most important critical social work theorist in the English-speaking world. Dr. Paul Michael Garrett, he's well known for sharing dissenting social work, which is an approach drawing on critical social work theory and habits of self-questioning that interrogates dominant ways of understanding the social world within the discipline of social work. So you can only imagine why we wanted to talk to him.
Yeah. And you can find more about Dr. Paul Michael Garrett on his website. It's www.pmgarrett.dsw.com. And if you have any questions or you want to reach out to him for anything, you can reach him at his email address is pm.garrett, Garrett, at University of Galway, GALWAY.IE. And you can find that information here on the episode description as well. Well, unfortunately, with the time differences we were juggling a lot in this one. We had Ireland. Dr. Garrett was in Ireland. Me and MT were in Chicago, and Alicia was in Hawaii. So, unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us for this discussion. Lucky for me, I had Jerome MT there to kind of carry your weight. How do you think we did without you? Did you like the episode?
Yeah, I mean, it could have used a female touch, but no, I'm just kidding. My only thing is I just wish I'd been able to speak to Dr. Paul Michael Garrett. I think you guys are going to enjoy this episode. He has a big impact on the field right now. He's a good voice to listen to. So,
yeah, well, it definitely would have been a different pace if we had you there. But hopefully we'll get Dr. Garrett back another time on the podcast and we can get a discussion going between the three of us. But all right, then, let's get to it. Here is episode number 19 of the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast featuring Dr. Paul Michael Garrett.
Hey, listen, we got some things that we gotta discuss. How we can affect the system and make it better for us. But first, we gotta start with the man in the mirror. Open your third eye and the vision's gonna be much clearer. We are revolutionary. We are visionary. And we stand resolute on those who pollute the minds of many. Revolutionary. We are visionary. And we stand resolute on those who pollute the minds of many, y'all. This is the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast, y'all.
All right. We are here with another episode of the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast. And we're still here live in Chicago at the NASW National Conference. This is the second one we've done. I'm here with my friend and brother and partner, MT. And also joined by Dr. Paul Michael Garrett, all the way from Ireland. I guess it's afternoon for you. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I guess for yourselves, for you guys, it's maybe breakfast time. Here it's 2:00, just after lunch. Looking out the window, looks like it might rain as well. So kind of typical Irish conditions, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly how I would imagine it. Yeah. Yeah, everyone over here it's also... I was mentioning before we got on live that it's kind of strange to be here live doing it and everybody's walking around and everybody's getting their breakfast. And so it's also kind of distracting. Mm-hmm. But we're happy to be here, and I hope we can reach out to some of these folks and teach them a little bit about dissenting social work. Yeah. Like MT was saying, we were watching the video that you sent this morning. And I think there's quite a few things that we can talk about, but I thought we should just start from the beginning and, maybe do a little groundwork and contextualize what is dissenting social work.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for inviting me. I think it's great that you organise these kind of fringe events at big conferences to provide the space for kind of maybe voices on the margins that are trying to do things maybe outside the status quo, outside the mainstream. So thanks yourself, Christian, and obviously thanks to Jerome as well, who I met for the first time before we came live. It was nice to have a bit of a conversation beforehand.
Yeah, we're brothers now. I'm excited.
So yeah, dissenting social work, I guess, and I don't want it to appear like a thing or a brand, but what it represents, the vibe, is maybe to evolve a kind of more critical perspective within especially social work education. And I guess the basis for it, and a lot of the thinking I was doing around dissenting social work, the base was during COVID, where I guess all of us had kind of more time to think. I'd been involved previously in lots of social movements. I'd been involved in a group called the Social Work Action Network. And around the time I was writing and thinking about dissenting social work, there were a lot of ideas emerging around social work. And one of the key ones was an idea promoted by a very kind of engaging Australian guy called Chris Malia. And essentially, his idea was that social work had failed. Yeah. And so he was calling for the end of social work. And I engaged with him in more detail in the book, but I didn't think it was a very kind of convincing analysis. You know, it seemed to be taking us towards a brick wall. Yeah. Maybe shortly afterwards as well, there were kind of ideas emerging, particularly in your part of the world, in the United States, but also spreading elsewhere to Australia and so on, around abolitionist social work. And again, I found some of the ideas associated with that promoted by people like Mimi Kim and colleagues, kind of, tremendously interesting. But I also had some difficulties with some of the notions contained within abolitionist kind of conversations. So I guess dissenting social work was kind of grounded in the idea that, okay, we need to kind of own up to the defects in the profession and its history. The way that it's associated, it can be associated with collusion and promotion of oppressive practices. Yeah. But for me, the question is, well, what do we do now? How can we look to kind of reignite, if not a revolutionary social work, because I don't think we're at that stage, a more social work with more of a critical edge, which is informed and energized by some of the social movements that are around. And particularly at the time when I was writing was the movement for Black Lives in the States, for example. Shortly before that, the Occupy movement. And I suppose just to say by way of health warning as well, I realized that I'm speaking to guys in Chicago in the States, and my knowledge of the specifics around social work, politics and culture in the States is kind of limited. The last time I was in the States was in 2018. I spent a month in New York at the City University of New York, but my awareness of what's going on there, as I say, is somewhat limited, although clearly I realize that they're troubled times, certainly troubled times at the moment. So some of the ideas within dissenting social work, what I'm alert to is that, they'll perhaps play out differently in different places. I'm not trying to produce a kind of arrogant kind of manifesto. I'm looking to open up spaces for kind of critical thought and discussion around the future of social work. So hoping that's not too lengthy and rambling an answer there, Christian.
No, not at all. I appreciate it. I think there's a number of routes we can go from here to talk about it. But one of the things that has drawn me to dissenting social work and which drew me to you is, and obviously, like we're speaking in different contexts, Ireland and the United States, and there's obviously going to be some differences, but a trend or a series of trends that have troubled me with social work is kind of like a herd mentality of not being able to be critical and being dissenting at all seems to be almost this esoteric and I don't know, like there seems to be a lot of resistance to that, to any kind of dissent or any kind of movement away out of the status quo or out of the norm. And it's been troubling me for a while. So I really appreciate you for broaching these topics and for putting a more of a critical eye, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Do you see that kind of like I said, the herd mentality where social workers are kind of almost always staying within the status quo? There's no dissent. There's a lack of critical engagement.
Yeah, I guess trying to be a little careful. I suppose that, I mean, what I'm trying to do in books like Dissenting Social Work is have my contribution informed by, discussions and practices of many others. So I suppose it's acknowledging there are a lot of kind of critical practitioners and educators out there. Although, I guess it's probably the same in the States, we are kind of on the margins. There is perhaps a tendency, and, I was struck by the strapline of the National Association of Social Workers conference, which is about celebrating social work, which I guess is important in the times we live, But at the same time, I think it's important to be critical of social work as well as celebrating it. And I think that's where some of the work being done around abolition is tremendously important, to highlight how social workers has kind of oftentimes collaborated, with the profession serving as a pipeline into the prison system, particularly for kind of African American peoples and others, minority ethnicities, others who are living in poverty and misery. But I suppose just to fall back into the other part of your question as well, Christian, I think, it's a little bit of a luxury for me to talk about dissent because I'm in a kind of privileged position. Yeah. I'm I'm a white guy here. I've been a lecturer now for over 20 years. I've been able to carve out, partly because of my identity as well, a certain freedom, a certain space to be critical. And I think it's about recognizing it's not the same for everybody out there. Yeah. If you're a social worker in many places of the world, including Ireland, it's very difficult to be critical, because if you're perceived occasionally as too critical, you could get marginalized, you could get ostracized, you could find your routes to promotion being blocked, and so on. So one of the things I try to convey as best I'm able to in the book is it seems important to me for those who are dissenting, for those who are critical within social work, for those who want to move beyond what you guys call the status quo, it's tremendously important to do things collectively. Yeah. To not do things individually, because if you do things individually, the risk is you can get kind of picked off. Yeah. So one of the things I try to develop in the book, but not in any detailed way, and hopefully others will pick up on this, I talk about the significance of structures within structures, setting up progressive organizations within social work organizations, within social work education organizations, which are protective of individuals. And if one operates collectively, I guess there's more chance there of creating progressive change. So I suppose, again, in the book and some of the other things I've written, I'm just trying to move towards different types of conversations as opposed to saying, well, I think this is the route out of the difficulties that we face, because again, that would just be kind of silly and a bit arrogant.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I feel like you operate from a deep sense of humility and self-awareness when you're approaching it. And I think all of us we're not actual professional social workers that are out on the grind. You and I, are at the university. But I think you made a good point. There are plenty of people that are critical about social work and critical within social work, but we do get put in the margins, and it makes it hard for us to be collective sometimes because we're all spread out and all over the place, whereas some of the more mainstream, places like this conference. But I'm heartened all the time. We connected with some of the other podcasters and influencers here, and they seem to be doing dissenting social work, with remnants of revolutionary social work as well. But
yeah, I think that's, just to pick up on that, if I may, Christian, and I suppose it's a bit of a shout out for those folks who are trying to kind of develop ideas around abolition, which again, I have some difficulties with, but I think, there's a good progressive cutting edge to a lot of the conversations being had in that context. There are journals based in the States as well, like the Journal of Progressive Human Services. There's some seriously critical academics are crossing over into kind of social work literature. People like the African-American scholar Dorothy E. Roberts has written tremendously fascinating and important stuff in relation to incarceration and, African-American and other minority ethnic groups in the care system and so on. And within social theories.
One thing that I really find interesting about the way you put it is it seems like you're creating a platform to talk about, or to provide a critical platform for the practicality of it, right? It really seems like, how are these practices within these different systems? How can we provide infrastructure? How can we provide maybe a shift of values or a shift of focus, new creative, innovative processes to help fortify the mission, right, of what social work is supposed to be within these social structures? And so, what are some of like the practical ways that people can like be critical or more critical of the profession and provide services? Is there some things that you've already observed?
Yeah, again, Jerome, I mean, it's the question to ask, isn't it, really? It's how does kind of more critical approaches, how do they kind of translate into practices? And I suppose, I guess from where I'm located, I think that begins in, certainly on the one hand, in classroom discussions, right? And this may seem, I don't know, an odd way to come at it, but I think people like myself have got a lot to learn from students. Yeah. For example, on the course I teach on now, I worked here for over 20 years. When I started the course, essentially the people coming on the course, and this isn't to disparage them, it's just to objectively describe them, I guess they would be essentially kind of white, middle class, Irish. Over the past number of years, the people coming onto the course, the students, the composition has changed enormously. So we have a lot of students who are from Africa, from places like Kenya, from places like Nigeria. We have those of African heritage who were maybe born in Ireland. So they have experiences of the world which kind of signal ways that social workers can go out and practice in a more kind of progressive way. They'll have life experiences, many of them around questions to do with asylum and so on, immigration policing. So they're full of kind of knowledge which is grounded in kind of lived experience. So I think it's picking up from them in terms of what kind of practices can be developed out there. Yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think I referred in passing maybe a little earlier, there have been attempts in Ireland and elsewhere to set up more progressive social work organisations. So one that is still around in, for example, the UK is the Social Work Action Network. And the Social Work Action Network looks to bring together educators, practitioners, users of services to kind of talk about and try and organise how social work services can be delivered differently. And in the present moment, how can they be defended from kind of neoliberal budgetary cuts and so on. Now, just a final thing on that. I mentioned the UK. One of the areas where Social Work Action Network is doing really well and thriving is oddly enough in Belgium. And the YouTube interview that I sent yourself, Christian, was organised by Swan Belgium. And I think that gives an indication to perhaps folks in the States of the type of work that Swan's doing in Belgium. Again, probably too lengthy an answer there, Jerome. But yeah, I think it's learning from people with a plurality of experience in the classroom who are going to go out there and be practitioners, and also trying to set up, again, it's this structures within structures alternative pockets of resistance within the mainstream.
One of the things I appreciate most about what you said is, respecting and using the knowledge from students. We're not just there to, like Paulo Freire would call the banking model, just to deliver them the
Precisely.
information. They all come with knowledge, wisdom, and experience, and can contribute. I think there are a few comments in the chat that we can get to. And first of all, peace, Kyle Toon. Glad that you're here, and I'll get to your comment in a minute. It's kind of a similar question. Maybe we can get a little deeper. She says, what are some key ways that social workers can dissent or be more critical of their profession and how they provide services?
Yeah, I guess thanks for the question. I mean, in the book Dissenting Social Work, and again, I'll try not to say that again because it comes across like an advert, doesn't it? It's like we're introducing an ad break into the conversation. But I begin by saying that dissent in and of itself is not to be valued. Yeah. One can have dissent from the right. We can have dissent from, I don't know, in the States, from, say, the Proud Boys. Fascists can be dissenters as well. So, I mean, it depends on the content of dissent. Yeah. What kind of the agenda are, what may be some of the main themes. And I guess in the book, again, in a very kind of general way, I kind of identify maybe a few kind of themes in very general terms that dissent could be built around, or at least have conversations around, yeah? Mm-hmm. So I sketch out just about kind of 12 themes. I won't kind of touch on all of them, if that's okay, because people will just get tremendously bored. But I talk about, for example, dissenting social work is attuned to and seeks to eradicate the harms caused to humans, other species, and the planet by capitalism. Now, that's just like a slogan, isn't it? So the difficult thing is, well, if we think this notion is meaningful, how does it translate into social work education and social work practice? I talk about, dissenting social work tries to decolonize social work knowledge, to critically confront settler colonialism, and to learn from perspectives derived from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Because certainly our kind of knowledge base for social work in places like Ireland, and of course Ireland's kind of strange because Ireland of course was colonized, but much of our knowledge is grounded in what I'd call kind of colonial common sense. So it's trying to introduce ideas from beyond or outside of that common sense. I mean, a classic example who's been around for some while, who you mentioned, Christian, is Freire. But there are others also emerging from Latin America, kind of interesting thinkers. There's people like Frantz Fanon, also we try to introduce into kind of classroom discussions. And as I said earlier, what's significant here as well is the wealth of experience that people have in the classroom. Just to touch on one other perhaps theme in relation to dissenting social work, which I think is probably more meaningful at present, and I notice it's one of the concerns of the conference. I have here, dissenting social work appreciates the tremendous gains which technology brings, but is alert to the threats posed by techno-authoritarianism. The fact that social work could become a profession that is entirely steered by algorithms and artificial intelligence, that is increasingly directed by predictive analytics, yeah? And there's been some interesting work done in the States by people like Virginia Eubanks, Dorothy Roberts, about how algorithms, in terms of issues around child protection, policing, it still leads to the targeting of the same people. Minority ethnic populations are people of color, poor people, because the data that's leading to the predictive analytics is being constructed around previous practices. So we're getting caught in this kind of loop, So there needs to be kind of big conversations had about, the use of artificial intelligence in social work. I wouldn't have any answers, but clearly the conversation is vital. And we need to be alert to how these systems devised by big tech, who essentially want to make more money, are out to make profit, not serve people, how they're going to embed kind of racism, impoverishment, patriarchy. Enormous questions, aren't they?
Definitely are. And I think it's very interesting, the topic of artificial intelligence, because as we're speaking right now, I think the plenary session is going on at the conference, and it's a panel, I think, uplifting the idea of artificial intelligence in social work. And I'm seeing this all over social media, and I guess I don't know exactly where it's coming from, but it seems deeply troubling and to me. And it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. I hate to use the term herd mentality, but I feel like in social work, when something new comes along and it's pushed by the powers that be, that oftentimes folks collectively get in line with that without being able to find any room to dissent or look at it critically. Anybody that does so is kind of looked at as the outlier or the rabble rouser or whatnot. People aren't necessarily having these conversations. Like I said, I think it's very interesting that that's the session that they're having right now at the same time.
Yeah.
And I have one of my advisors at the University of Alaska. His name is Asikluk. He's an Alaska Native professor. And he argues that, artificial intelligence has no place in anything to do with Indigenous folks or Indigenous studies or anything like that. And then I also spoke to Dr. Michael Yellowbird out of Canada, and he's kind of the opposing and thinks that artificial intelligence can benefit social work in this ideas of, like, say, language revitalization and things like that. So I think it's a conversation that we should be deeply concerned about before it completely gets away from us, because I see all sorts of services advertising, case notes done by artificial intelligence to, I hear a lot of reports as well about people using artificial intelligence for their therapy, outside of using an actual therapist. So.
Yeah, is it okay just to pick up on that point for a second? Is that okay? Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. There's been some really interesting work done in Britain in terms of, for example, the use of predictive analytics to identify criminal gang members. Yeah. And there's been reports on the police in London's use of these systems. And the reports have been produced by respectable organisations like Amnesty International and so on. And, surprise, surprise, what they reveal is that the people being identified as potential gang members are wholly disproportionately black men. Do you know, the system is kind of promoting, if you will, kind of more racist forms of intervention. Now, the second point is I'm just beginning to acquaint myself with this issue, but I think you rightly draw attention to it, Jerome. The business of AI making social work notes. In England, I'm not sure about what's going on in Ireland presently, but there's systems like, for example, one called Magic Notes, which kind of records notes for social workers, and I think there's a number of problems with this without getting into too much detail. But one is the suggestion that, the note taking can be just devolved to AI, whereas actually note taking is part and parcel of the social work activity. When one is writing notes, one's kind of thinking, reflecting. It's part of social work as opposed to be something that can be devolved to AI, I think. And the other thing, and I don't know if this is going on the same way in the States, and I guess you guys will be able to come back on this, but the way that AI is often being promoted for social work organizations is, it'll make the job easier. You'll be able to get by with not as many social workers. It's saturated in neoliberal logics. It's about trimming the social work workforce to enable tasks to be done by AI and so on. So lots of things to get into thinking about. I suppose finally, for me, one can only really understand AI in social work and how it's potentially been introduced if one links it to, the C word, to capitalism, to neoliberal capitalism, and how, it's big tech largely are standing to profit from this. And I guess in the States, when you've had a situation where for a number of weeks, Musk was in the White House and Doge was ripping up the federal workforce, this is kind of indications for all of us in terms of how AI can be potentially used against the people and the services that are provided for the people.
Absolutely. And I think just my own personal reflections as a professor and somebody's, talking to social workers all the time is that people feel more disconnected than ever, and they're desiring to be reconnected, and artificial intelligence does the exact opposite of that. And it takes away what I see as the major need right now is that idea of connection or reconnection. You have any thoughts? You want to go to the
when you guys brought it up, especially when you started talking about like the indigenous perspective, my elders and I, we talk a lot about the new technology, and we understand human technology as like another element of nature, right? And so, like all things, it is the purpose and the intention that the human uses the tool for, that guides and creates the effects of that tool. Like if you pick up a hammer, you could build a home with it, but you can also kill something with it. It depends on the purpose that's being used. So, again, like Paul, your critique, right, of the processes and the effects in pushing people to have the conversations is one that's in my community has been like is really rampant, right? Like especially in the 50s and 60s, that critique of social structure and therefore social work, it was pretty common. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this conversation is let's critique what the purpose is, right? And also how much do we want to alleviate our tasking? Like you said, like writing and taking notes is a part of the practice of social work or the way that it's been organized, right? In our traditions and like the indigenous traditions, we're like, oh, we can build an AI system that's focused around our principles and values and help people use a creative brain that's rooted in our principles and values and virtues, because that's what's being done, right? Like that's what we're seeing is like no matter how you identify and frame it, by the character of these systems, by the characters of these processes, we can see, how it's developing the human relationship. And so if it's removing us from human relationship, then we need to challenge, we need to criticize, we need to come together and collaborate on new ideas about this thing, because it's stopping the flow of human relationship, right? As social workers or people that are involved with social working, you know, that how does society work? Through collaboration and understanding and human connection. And so we don't want to, we want to mitigate how much of that we remove, but be able to give, like I would say, how can we use AI to get rid of all of the stuff that I have to do for the institutional, governmental, organizational process that is a part of the system of healthcare, but then so that I can focus on the human connection, so that I can make sure that I'm taking the type of notes that are going to be revolutionary, transformative, and connecting and holistic for the person that I'm dealing with. Because as the workers of our society, the people that are investing in it, that time and energy and an effort, like our job or our goal should be to develop or enlighten or expand the human connection and the capacity to connect to other humans with the person that we're dealing with. And then we probably can go to somebody else to help us do it once we've done it too many times in a row, right? But I think that type of conversation and the way that you're directing it is really important, and it's one that's reflected in like my experience as an American African, right? Like it's really a part of our cultural critique of the social systems that we're in. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful book by, you may be familiar with her, called, she's Rua Benjamin, who wrote a book, I may get the title slightly wrong, Race After Technology, something like that. I do apologize to her if I'm getting the title wrong, but I guess, I mean, entirely agreeing and following up with what you're saying there, Jerome. I mean, the other important point is frequently, in the context of, I suppose, racial capitalism, technology is often trialed on minority and impoverished peoples. Yeah. And I think that's one of the kind of great risks at the moment in terms of how, particularly, again, as I say, predictive analytics has been used in the context of child protection and policing in a number of countries. And the other point, just to add, following up on your comment, Jerome, you insert this phrase social structure. I mean, it's kind of vital, isn't it, to have a sense of the social structure?
Yeah.
Because I suppose one of my worries as well around AI is potentially, and this isn't dismissing its usefulness, there may be tremendous gains from AI, of course, but presently, given the sort of social structure we have, I think it will be potentially used more to kind of manage poverty, misery, and hardship rather than trying to eradicate poverty, misery, and hardship. I think it will be used as technology to maintain the existing system. I think that is the key word for social workers and others, I guess, are more interested in looking at stuff critically.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a really interesting point at the end there. Really knowing the social system, like you've said it a few times, you've highlighted the fact that it is circumstantial, right? Like the place from which you're dissenting, the purpose for which you're dissenting, it is circumstantial based on your vantage point, right? Like I think you said, hey, I'm out here as an observer and I'm looking at these systems that have a lot of evidence, have a lot of data, have a lot of experience that say that this, and I think that's the appropriate place. Like you do that so well as someone that's a part of that social system. Seeing your reflection of it in your observation is very accurate on the things that we're questioning. How can we find ways to better improve the connection and relationship of humans within this social structure? And that's kind of a thing, right? Is like we're trying to remedy something that, like you said, maybe we need some new infrastructure, to help build it up. Like maybe we need to put some rods in the broken leg, to help it stand straight, and we need to cast it a little bit. Maybe we need some, fortifications to help us maintain like the structure of what the purpose of our work is. I think the way that you framed it in Dissenting has really made it really clear on like it is based on your circumstance, based on the conditions of the environment you're working. You need to find the ways where dissenting will provide better human connection and make your organizations and your processes and societies flow and connect better. It's really interesting. It's great to hear your perspective. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, which again, to have that happen, I guess, Jerome, it might call for a totally different economic and social system, because the things that we're trying to remedy, it might not be possible in the current economic and social system. I mean, in not to get too kind of theoretically driven, but in Dissenting Social Work, I also refer to Antonio Gramsci a lot, kind of theorist activist who died days within coming out of Mussolini's prison. And he used this word, the interregnum, and he's referring to a society that was facing a number of kind of interlocked crises. I guess in our current context, we can talk about neoliberalism, global warming, and so on, the rise of kind of authoritarian governments and so on. And he said the thing about an interregnum, it's a period when the old is dying and the new cannot be born. We're stuck at this moment. But I think the sort of themes we're touching on kind of suggest there is a need for something new to be born, because we face so many moments of trouble and crises.
It makes me think also about, we were listening to that video earlier this morning, and I think in our last conversation too, you had critiqued abolition social work. I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Detlef here in the United States, but on one hand, he's an example of what happens sometimes when you dissent. He was fired from his position, and I think he was the dean of the Department of Social Work. But on the other hand, you also critique it in saying that, we're not, like, what do we do when we still have need for social workers if we're abolishing social work? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Again, my acquaintance with this literature may be kind of lacking, but oddly enough, I do have a chapter up and coming with a colleague in a volume on abolitionism. I think it's published in September. I mean, essentially, I accept lots of the analyses in terms of, you know, how social work is apt to serve as a pipeline, you know, for lots of people into the criminal justice system, you know, into kind of imprisonment for periods, into the care system. We have a situation in Ireland where I suppose a similar pattern, although the numbers are different, to the United States, where there's a disproportionately high number of children from Black minority ethnic groups are in the care system. Yeah, we have a situation where this group, particular to Ireland, Irish traveller populations, there's a disproportionately high number in the care system, a disproportionately number of Irish travellers in prison also. So it's an interesting dynamic. So the critique developed by people like Alan and Mimi and others, I mean, I find kind of fascinating. The problem I run up against, though, well, maybe two problems. The first is, I think in lots of ways, the conversation around abolition is very kind of US centric. Yeah. And I think the situation is maybe different in other parts of the world. This is why the volumes that's coming out in September is kind of interesting, because it brings together perspectives from lots of other places. The second problem I have is, and I know this is not the same across abolitionist conversations, but the idea that, you know, prisons should be abolished, because I'm not wholly convinced by that idea. I think whatever social system, economic system evolves, there may well be a need for some form of imprisonment. You know, if there is major social change, let's say let's use this word revolutionary change, you know, there's going to be groups who oppose that change. You know, if there's no prisons, where the fascists going to be put? Do you know? I don't want to be facetious here, but who writes very interestingly on this is Lenin around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was insistent that, you know, for a period, you know, places of incarceration and so on had to be still available, because if they weren't, how would the revolution defend itself? Yeah. So these might seem abstract kind of considerations, but you know, the things which I think maybe conversations within abolition needs to grapple with. One of the things that I am convinced about, though, and this is what I find one of the most fascinating aspects of a lot of the debates within abolitionist social work, is how a lot of social work intervention is becoming, well, shall we say, somewhat deteriorating in terms of kind of copying the practices of the prison. So to give an example, here in Ireland, there are kind of facilities for the homeless, and many of these facilities, called hubs, are available for female single parents. Now, the striking thing about these hubs for the homeless is the women who enter them with their children are subject to kind of intense surveillance. They're almost like semi-prison-like environments, yeah? So I think some of the conversations taking place within, around abolition and social work kind of serve to kind of illuminate what's taking place in areas like that. You know, this replicating the practices of the prison in everyday society, which is tremendously worrying. To give another example, you know, when people claim welfare benefits here, and I guess this has happened in a number of other countries as well, the process has tremendously changed in recent years. So, for example, if one goes to claim welfare benefits in Ireland now for the first time, you're kind of photographed. You know, you have a mugshot. It's like you've been arrested by the cops when you check in to claim benefits for the first time. So there are all these kind of practices of the prison and practices derived from policing, which are kind of drifting into the civil sphere. And again, that's kind of something which is immensely disturbing, I think.
Yeah, well, in the sense, just from things like this and our phones and everything else, is that we're living in an opticon in our everyday lives to some degree, if you think about it. Another thought that I had was, you know, just reflecting on the prison abolitionist movement going back to Angela Davis and the 60s and 70s and so on, is that on one hand, I feel like it's been successful in helping us generate ideas and different ways to look at things and making us more aware. But if you look at the actual movement, the prison system has only continued to increase substantially since that point. And so in that sense, it's been a failure. And I don't think that sometimes we want to talk about that. I think that, I can't remember her name and I was going to look it up, but there's a book called A Reckoning or something like that that talks about what do you do with what happens with all the violence and whatnot if you're abolishing the prison system. What do you do? And we were talking about this a little bit this morning, is that I think ideally in a perfect world, we could live without prisons, but we've got to this point in society right now where it doesn't seem to fit right now. But
Yeah.
you also mentioned, looking outside to other cultures and whatnot. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's like from the indigenous perspective, when we think of social work is the responsibility of every human being. And it's the work every human does to make our village, to make our human race function, communicate, and collaborate, right? Like creativity is the God principle, right, of the indigenous world, is to be able to be in flow with creativity and collaboration and co-creation, right? That's the basic principles. So when we have examples like in Africa, even modern day times, we have certain tribes that have a very different type of justice system, right? We don't have imprisonment. We have a real covenant of relationship. So when something is slighted, when something is, there's a misgiving, there's a mishappening, there's some type of conflict within the tribe, what they do is they take the person, they put them in the middle, everyone comes around, and before we even bring up the thing that you did, everyone that's in that circle, especially the adult males, we have to speak the benefits of your character so far, right? So we have to uplift you and raise you and praise you for the good of your humanity, of your works, of your actions, of your character. And then we say, we recognize this. Now, this is what happened. What do you have to say for yourself, knowing that what's needed to repair is a little time, a little space, and a little reflection? So at the very most, we're going to make sure that you stay outside of the peaceful, organized working, allow you to develop. We can, if you need some assistance, we'll even send some attendants for you, right? And help you through this process. And then when you're ready to come back into the flow and be a part of the organized collaborative energy again, you get back attuned, then there's a process for that too. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to bring you in. We're going to praise you. We're going to ask what you've learned, what you reflected on, and how your character has changed. And there's like a circle of men that have to say, like, that's a verified change. That's a revolution of your thinking. There's a renewing of your mind that's happened, right? Your purpose and drive has changed toward this action and connection. Then you're allowed to come back and be a full participant of the co-creative social system that we have, right? But it's a covenant of choice. So once you're praised and then we say, here's the thing, the person says, all right, either I'm going to do this type of penance, or I'm going to go into exile for a bit and get myself together and then reintegrate, or, there's options and ways for us to deal with that process, right? So for us, social work is, how can society work for common humanity? How can it work for unification and creation, right? Like that's the work, is like, it's a social responsibility, not an individual process. So for us, you have to change the orientation of your social framework, right? Before we can get rid of prisons, only because the mentality of the social system is imprisonment, and not imprisonment even in oppression, but literally the limitation and the segregation of issues, of problems, and categorizing it so much that there's no connection and relationship to other things that actually feed into it. Right? Like when we talk about incarceration, like you said, the data is no, there's a programming, right? The conversation my elders and I were having is the Western social system, especially in the United States, is hardware driven, right? The indigenous process and thinking is software driven. It's all about the connections. It's all about the inner workings. It's all about taking those ideas and those binary calculations and putting them in ways that they can collaborate so that we can get something done and create something, right? Not just like, how do we categorize it? How do we synthesize it? How can we, like, strip all the minerals and get it down to like one thing, rather than, no, this is a social thing. Therefore, it's a connected thing. It's an integrated thing. It's something that needs to be sit down with more than one person. It's not something that the human can do within themselves. The revolutionary process and transformative process is a human connection and intimate process that we have to all take as responsibility as human beings. Yeah.
Appreciate you, MT. There's a brother Kyle Toon has been in the chat that I feel like we should honor him for a moment. And first of all, peace and love to you too, Kyle. And we'll be speaking to you on Thursday, or a little Juneteenth conversation. But he has a couple comments here, then we can touch on both of them at the same time. He says, I've learned through deep reflection and prior dissension in military service is that being critical flows from an identity self-concept guided by conscience, values, and an extended self-conscience or consciousness. And then he also adds, adding on to what we were talking about abolitionism, he says, in the United States, abolition social work is typically centered on the notions of restorative justice and anti-carceral frameworks. Abolitionism as a philosophy and concept should be expanded beyond the prison industrial complex. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got one of the books literally at hand, and and I mean, listening to Jerome, I mean, I agree with much of what you're saying. I guess one of the difficulties that I have is around, the rise of kind of neo-fascism, in a number of places. We have situations in Ireland, elsewhere in Europe, where sadly there are organized fascist groups who look, for example, to set fire to the accommodation that's been designated for people fleeing to Ireland to gain asylum. I understand in principle entirely what you're saying about how to kind of engage with individuals, recognize them in their entirety, holistically, making connections. But there are obstacles oftentimes when you have got people so ideologically committed
absolutely,
to a fascist program.
Yeah.
It is more difficult, isn't it? Do you not think, Jerome?
Yeah, that's why I enjoy your critique. The critical nature of looking at the system based off of its character and what it's producing, because it's an industrial system, right? Like the system that we're looking at, it's an industrial system. So you have to look at the product of it, and if it doesn't match the purpose of what you say social work is for this system that you call a Western society, that's the real critique. Is like, how do we get this thing to work better? Nobody's saying it's wrong or it's bad, but we could so make this thing run in a more human way where people can co-create and collaborate, et cetera, right? And I think your vision and your perspective of your critique and creating the space of dialogue, right? Like that's one thing that I notice is very much a value in your purpose, is creating the space for dialogue, right? Not so much like, especially us Western thinkers and logical thinkers, we think critical means critical problem solving, when it really just means take your observation from outside of it just for a minute, actually be objective, right? Pull yourself out of the subject of it for a little bit and observe it and see what it is, and make critiques, both good and bad, see how it flows for the betterment, right? My godson, Ace's son, he's talking about being an engineer. And so a lot of my conversation with him is like how engineering helps smooth the process, right? In my field of practical spirituality and spiritual health, we think a lot about the inner engineering, right? Again, a principle or a mindset, a vantage point of looking at the software, right? Like the hardware is there, right? The structure is there, but it's the software, the thing that makes the thing work, that might need an update, right? An update for the things that we've learned have been products of our approach, right? Like the idea isn't wrong, maybe, but the approach could use a little tweaking, and we're not going to get there without being critical and coming to those spaces of dialogue that you know are very consistent in mentioning. Like, these are the spaces that we need to come to, because this is where we can find oil to put into the gears to make it run smoothly in a better way and produce healthier, happier, more, you know, functional social systems.
And I guess the challenge is as well that, you know, these spaces for critical conversations, they risk being shut down. Again, I think you know, it is a difficult time, you know, in different ways, in different places, but we need to do all we can to try and protect our critical spaces, you know, because otherwise, you know, there'll be less space to breathe, to think, to talk about alternatives.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. Thank you.
Yeah, well, this has been an incredible conversation. We're hitting up on the hour mark. I know that was our goal.
Sure.
But I wonder if either of you have anything else on your mind that we haven't covered yet.
To tell you the truth, I have enjoyed occupying the space where we're having the type of conversations you're talking about, Paul, like a real critical conversation of observation, one that's co-creative, one that was collaborative, one that was building, right, foundational. A conversation that Ace and I have been having about some of my own personal work has been fortifying those spaces for the men in my community and the brotherhood of the things that I work in the communities that I work in, because it seems like that used to be a high function for men in our old indigenous systems. Was like, you know, here's a place where we can agree to certain rules and be really critical of something and not get hurt, or, you know, not let our tensions rise, but really try to work it out, really try to find a new way to get these gears moving, or, you know, to solve this issue, or to identify something else that might be better for us. You know, like, I feel like the exploratory nature of this conversation as we're being critical, I really enjoyed that, you know, like, from your perspective and then of mine, and then Ace really like bridging those things. Man, I really enjoyed that collaborative critical thinking being shared between three men. So yeah, man, especially from across the pond, man, much love, peace, and power. I appreciate your perspective and the things that you shared. It was really
Yeah.
enriching.
Thank you. I mean, as you say, yeah, coming back at you, Jerome. Yeah, I mean, really enjoyed the conversation. I think there was a nice kind of vibe to it, you know, in terms of how we moved this along. And again, I think it's great, this kind of program that you've put up on the Fringe, you know, the series of podcasts, you know, involving kind of women and men from a range of different places to think about things kind of differently. So thanks to both of you, really, you know, just for creating this opportunity, and wishing you well into the future, lads.
It's been great. Sorry, there's a little delay, and so sometimes I'm hesitating to wait to make sure that somebody's not still speaking. But I think in social work and in other realms as well, we market diversity, but often diversity is only in superficial categories, and it doesn't have a lot to do with diversity of thought or diversity of ideas. And so I think, you know, like, I appreciate that, you know, your feedback on the series of podcasts that we're having. But I think this is what it's all about, is having these dialogues, having these conversations that aren't, and bringing them outside of the fringe, and, you know, kind of collectivizing them, and so that we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, just one other thing to add as well. If anybody who is listening to this wants to fire off an email to me, you know, in terms of any kind of comments, any exchanges, then you can put my email up as well, I guess, there, Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put it in the description and everything, and also they can go to paulmichaelgarrett.com, right?
Well, it's a bit longer, but I'll send it on to you.
Okay. Yeah, I know I've got it, but I'll put it all in the description and all of that so folks can find you.
Cool.
Once again, big thank you for your time, Dr. Garrett. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that we can continue to connect as we move forward.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, man.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast, and we just want to say thank you for your continued support. You can catch us on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. Remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share our content with the world. But most of all, never forget to keep being revolutionary. Peace.